Today we're going to be looking at how impactful the first age of exploration was for all the world, really looking more closely at the way that the Americas changed rather than how Europe changed. What I want to get across to you during this lecture is that the impact was not so much immediate, but was definitely long-lasting. And in the fact that it is long-lasting, it obviously continues to impact the organization of the Americas and the social structure of the Americas even to this day. That said, there's a lot of beneficial exchange going on during this time, but sometimes the elements of that beneficial aspect aren't really known until we can look at them with hindsight. Let's begin by looking at where colonies were. Of course, you've seen this, you've read this in your textbook, but just for argument's sake, the Dutch Republic did manage to maintain some colonies in the Americas. The Dutch Republic, though, it's a really small territory compared to, say, England or France or Spain, and so their colonies are going to be correspondingly small. That said, they're going to be unique in a lot of ways from colonies of other countries, and that's because in Europe, the Dutch Republic itself had a reputation for tolerance. People of various religions were able to live in the Dutch Republic, and so long as you follow the laws of the Dutch Republic, you were welcome. They published texts that were critical of society and of governments, even when other publishers wouldn't do it. So they had this reputation going on, and perhaps because their aim in establishing colonies was immediately commercial as opposed to just controlling lots of territory, that tolerance expanded to its colonies as well. The Dutch Republic is going to initially own lands in the northern part of North America, basically what we kind of in the modern day call the state of New York. They're going to control a little part of South America, just along the northern coastline, which becomes Suriname, and they're going to control some of the islands in the Caribbean. So kind of spot locations, but important locations, because these locations are going to enable them to get involved in commercial enterprise such as lumber or fur trade, sugar plantations. They're going to get involved with tobacco and coffee farming, and of course, because plantations are a part of their commercial enterprise, they are going to be involved in the slave trade as well. In some ways, this mimics what's going on in the English colonies. However, unlike the Dutch, whose contracts are given out to companies who want to engage in this commercial enterprise, the English colonies, especially the early ones, are founded by groups of people who are trying to escape persecution in various ways. So we have the Pilgrims and the Puritans who escaped persecution in England, and they found the colonies of New England. You have the Catholics who are similarly escaping persecution in England, and they form the colony of Maryland. And then we have the Anabaptists, and these are Protestants who believed in adult baptism, and moreover, they believed that you shouldn't swear an oath of allegiance to a secular lord, only to God, which made them pretty undesirable across Europe at this time. And so you have groups of Anabaptists, like the Mennonites or the Quakers, who settle in Pennsylvania, or modern-day Pennsylvania. These groups are small, and they're farmers, and so what they're seeking to do is just escape persecution, but try to live life the way they're used to living it. So they form small towns, but these are farming, they're agricultural towns. They do get involved in trade because, of course, some of the people who move there are craftsmen, they're artisans, and so they set up shop. But by and large, their goal isn't to try to figure out how to harness, how to exploit the land for its lumber or its fur, etc. It's how to live just regularly in a new place. The Spanish and the Portuguese have kind of a mixed aim in going across. Of course, they were the ones who kicked off the age of exploration for Europe, and so they did want to engage in commercial enterprise, but they also just wanted to control a lot of land. And their aim first was, let's claim as much land as we can and then figure out what's there. So it was a little more hit or miss than what we see going on, say, with the Dutch or even with the English. Because the Spanish and the Portuguese were claiming this land directly. They expected to control the land directly as well. And so rather than having kind of indirect rule, the way that we see in the Dutch Republic colonies or in the English colonies, what you see in Spanish and Portuguese colonies are viceroyalties. These are areas ruled by a viceroy, and a viceroy can literally means assistant king. This was a person whose ties politically, perhaps even familially, were very close with the monarchs of Spain and Portugal, and who were expected to execute whatever the monarch wanted. So they had much more direct control over their colonies, even initially, especially more so than did England or the Dutch Republic, at least initially. And the Spanish and Portuguese were also different from the English and Dutch in that they also relied on the institutional Catholic Church to help them in their colonizing efforts. Now, the goals of the church were to go and convert people. Of course, that's what the church did. But what the Spanish relied on them to do was to begin really incorporating Spanish culture and introducing Spanish culture to the Native Americans. The Spanish crown believed that this would make Native Americans easier to control, which is kind of true, but also not. But it gave these institutions the opportunity to go out to help exploration, to help claim land, but again, from the church's perspective, to save all of these people who had never heard of Jesus before and who were now ripe for conversion. As we move a little bit later on in time, say we're moving from the 1500s and 1600s into the 1700s, what we see is that all of the countries of Europe have really shifted in some way to commercial enterprise. But this is especially true of the French, the English, and the Dutch, where they have colonies that have a specific aim of commercial enterprise. Unlike the English and Dutch, but again, like the Spanish and Portuguese, the French will also help the Catholic Church and rely on the Catholic Church to help in their expansion of colony. So as we head into the 18th century, we see in Americas that are divided up in different ways, and you can see these really incredibly large territories that are viceroyalties. And you can see this kind of just amorphous territory that's the British territory, and all of these territories are kind of controlled by the little colonies that were established by smaller groups of people. And then you can see the Louisiana territory as well, of course, held by France, and how much of it there was and how relatively little of it they had explored up until that point in time. So now you're expanding with the hopeful purpose of being able to exploit the land in the northern part of the Americas for timber, for fur, and then for plantation purposes. In the southern part of America, as it turns out, for precious metals as well, particularly gold and silver, which it turns out were pretty plentiful in Spanish colonies, particularly in part of what we today call Argentina. We have the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, which, as its name implies, had a lot of silver mines. Of course, when we talk about exploitation of the land and what the land has to offer, in essence, the land also had humans to offer. And so we also look at the way in which humans were used as labor by Europeans. In Spanish and Portuguese controlled areas, what we tended to see was the establishment of an hacienda or fazenda system, hacienda being Spanish, fazenda being Portuguese, in which a person was given an enormous amount of land. And I'm talking hundreds of thousands, even millions of acres. This person, the hacendado or the patron, the owner, the boss, was then to organize their hacienda in specific ways. They were charged by the crown to be profitable, so they had to come up with some sort of enterprise on their land. So for some, this would be ranching. The Europeans are going to introduce cattle to the Americas. For others, it's going to be farming in a sort of plantation aspect, farming, right? Tobacco, cotton, sugar, that sort of thing. For others, it's going to be a mix of things, including silver mining, because there are going to be silver mines on the land. Many Native Americans, especially the poorer Native Americans, are almost immediately inserfed. So they automatically become kind of the lowest part of the social structure. In Spanish, the term is peon. So the peones, the serfs, go from being free under, or mostly free, under the Native American system to now being tied to the land. They can't do anything without the permission from their hacendado. The wealthier Native Americans, and then later poorer Spaniards who come across the Atlantic, are peasants. They're campesinos. And just as we see with peasants in old feudal Europe, these are people who have their own bits of land, they can farm their own bits of land, but they owe the hacendado part of their agricultural yield. So they're never quite free because they always owe somebody something. In a lot of the areas, you had land that was perfect for ranching. And so you get the creation of these enormously huge ranches. Well, you need ranch hands to deal with that. So the vaqueros, as they're known, cowboys are known in kind of Mexico and Central America, or the gauchos, as they are known in South America, become an integral part of the hacienda system. And in this way, you get to see kind of that full elaboration of commercial enterprise on the part of the Spaniards. The painting that you see here is, in theory, a typical hacienda. You can see that it's just a big part of land, very often by a water source, because that would be important if you were doing any sort of agricultural or animal husbandry work. Various buildings. My guess is that this building right here or this building right here is the actual hacienda, the house in which the hacendado lived. But you can see some of the peones and campesinos right here just getting some work done. It looks like they're doing laundry by the pond or by the lake. So this becomes a regular way of life now for the Native Americans after the arrival of the Spanish and the Portuguese. That said, the hacienda system also included, or even we could say evolves to become an encomienda system, in which the serfs and the peasants owe the state a labor tax. So they're not expected to pay a tax because they don't have the money, but they are expected to give their labor in service to the state. And this is just like what we see in medieval Europe, where serfs and peasants had to give up part of their own time to help build roads, bridges, canals, to help the state in any sort of work that it required, which also included building new silver mines in different parts of Spain. And from this encomienda system, we get the adaptation of the mita system, especially in South America. The mita system was invented by the Inca, who used it to keep control and expand their empire, keeping in mind that the Inca ruled over lots of different tribes in South America. The mita system under the Inca was relatively easy to bear. When people were called to do work for the mita, the work was of short duration and it was close to home. So the people didn't have to go out anywhere. They pretty much stayed and they bettered their own environment, which of course made people generally willing to do their mita service. The Spanish, on the other hand, really intensified this work and they made the Native Americans work far from home. So under the Spanish mita system, the Native Americans were forced to go away and do really hard work, usually in the silver mines. So it goes from an Inca system where every 7 years you owed 6 months of service to the Inca state, to a system in which very often yearly or for several years, a Native American male would have to go out and work in service of the state, and as I mentioned, usually in the silver mines. So the image that you see here on the left is of a silver mine, kind of in cross section, and you can see that basically silver mines are huge pits that are dug into the earth, and so you need these enormous ladder systems to get up and down the pit. That's already dangerous, just in and of itself. But you can imagine that as you're going down further into the pit, light is hard to come by, and so they used candles to light the way. The problem is that they are basically mining blind. So it was entirely possible for them to try to open up a new tunnel and for the entire mine to fill with water and for people to drown. For the mine to cave in because there was no way really to keep a structure in the tunnels. Or what probably happened most often, for the tunnelers to hit a pocket of flammable air. And since, of course, they're using candles, everything catches on fire, people die in an inferno, basically. And you have to wait for the fire to die down before people can go back and keep mining silver. Silver mining is also really hard on the lungs, and obviously it's just labor intensive because you mined out the silver, then you had to melt it down, and then melt it into bars so that it could be shipped across the Atlantic back to Spain. So the mita system became much more intensive, much more of a burden on the Native Americans, and where Native Americans were essentially used as slaves by the Spanish system. Life was a bit different for French and English and Dutch colonies in that they did use a plantation system, which is roughly similar to an hacienda system, but the other areas tended to depend overwhelmingly on slaves as labor. So, where the Spanish and the Portuguese, at least initially, depended more on serfs, English, Dutch, French are going to depend on slaves almost from the beginning. Slavery, of course, was a system that brought African natives across the Atlantic to be used as slaves in the plantation system, and in other ways, of course, as well. The African slaves who were brought across were not usually captured by Europeans. Most often, what happened was that Europeans who had ports in Africa, and these are primarily the Dutch and the Portuguese, are going to use those ports right along the coast to trade for goods from the African peoples. And as African tribes warred against one another, they took prisoners of war. Well, once the Africans realized that what the Europeans wanted was slaves, the prisoners of war became incredibly valuable, and Africans could trade their prisoners of war for gold, for other goods that they might want from the Europeans. So Europeans traded for African prisoners of war, who then became slaves in the European plantation system of the Americas. What you see here in this image is a tobacco plantation. You can tell all the tobacco leaves in the background. And you have an overseer there who's kind of documenting how many barrels of the leaves they are able to produce. So there's a count going on there in the foreground. The map here shows you the direction of slaves and also the percentages of slaves and where they went. So it's not to say that the Spanish did not use slaves, they did. And you can see, 2% of African slaves roughly were going to Spanish South America, 1 to 2% to Central America, including Mexico at this point in time. But the Spanish tended to use African slaves primarily as domestic labor because they had the peones, they had the serfs and the campesinos to do their agricultural work. Conversely, the Dutch, the French, the English, and then later the Portuguese, who start to really expand their plantation system, they're going to use African slaves as labor in their plantations. So look at this, 42% of African slaves who come across the Atlantic are coming directly to the Caribbean first, and then in some cases they're being sold again to other places. 38% went to Brazil, specifically. The slaves who went to Brazil had a particularly hard time. Whereas in English and French and ultimately Dutch colonies, the slaves were encouraged to form families because this was a way to maintain the slave population within a colony. The Portuguese did not encourage, in fact, did everything they could to discourage slaves from forming families because they wanted to get the maximum work out of their slaves. And this is really horrific when you apply it to an individual human being and you think about it that way. What the Portuguese were thinking, though, was I buy a slave and I want that slave to work at maximum capacity for as long as I possibly can. That said, an average life expectancy for slaves once they arrived in Portuguese plantations was between 5 and 7 years. So it was a really short life expectancy. The Portuguese didn't want to cut that work life short by allowing female slaves to get pregnant because that would take away some of their effectiveness as laborers. And so they tried to cut down on the family of any sort of slave population as quickly as they possibly could by not allowing slaves to marry, by discouraging males and female slaves to get together and meet. They weren't, of course, successful 100% of the time, but it's interesting, it's instructive to see just how much of the slave population went directly to Brazil, knowing that they're not going to live very long, unfortunately, once they get there. And finally, another method of labor that was used across the board in the Americas was indentured servitude. This was initially aimed at lower class Europeans who really wanted to get a fresh start in the Americas, but they didn't have the money to cross the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't have the money to buy a ticket for their passage. So what would happen is a wealthier person would engage a poorer person in a contract whereby they would pay the passage across the Atlantic and they would even pay room and board for a number of years, usually 5 to 7 years. In exchange, the person who was getting this trip across the Atlantic was to pay with their labor. So they owed 5 to 7 years labor to the person, after which they would be free. But the trick is that while you are an indentured servant, you're basically a serf. You can't marry, you can't do anything without the permission of your master. You might learn a new craft, which is great. You could learn to be a seamstress if you were female or any other sort of domestic craft. If you were male, you might be a farm laborer, a farm worker, but you might also have been indentured by a blacksmith or a publisher or somebody who just needed work in their offices. So there was a possibility of learning a new craft. There was a definite ability to get across the Atlantic, but you had to give up 5 to 7 years of your life in order to get there. But this was the way in which Europeans organized labor over time. And now slavery, as we well know, is ultimately abolished by the middle of the 19th century, except for Portugal. They take a little bit longer, and Brazil doesn't abolish slavery until the 1880s. But indentured servitude sticks around for an amazingly long time, beginning during this early age of exploration and continuing on to the early 20th century. The difference being that at the beginning of this period, the indentured servants were coming from Europe. By the end of this period, indentured servants were coming from Asia. So you have Chinese and Japanese and Korean peoples who are coming across the Pacific for service in the Americas. So let's talk a bit about how you get an impact on colonial society thanks to the arrival of the Europeans. Well, what we know is that before the Europeans arrived, all the different Native American tribes had their own social organization, which in some cases was hierarchical, in other cases was more egalitarian, but it was there, right? And it was theirs. But when the Europeans come in, they organize the land in different ways, they organize society in different ways, and so inevitably we do get a restructuring of colonial society in ways that still impacts us today. At the very top of any colonial society, regardless of where you were in the Americas, you have people who are born in Europe. If you were born in Europe and are living in the colonies, you're automatically at the top of the social ladder, especially if you have money. If you're wealthy, then you not only have that kind of ability to say, I'm better than you because I was born in Europe, but also I'm better than you because I have more money, which of course is understandable from an economic perspective, not just in the colonies, but also in Europe. Next down on the social ladder were the Creoles. Creoles, generally speaking, were people who had 100% European ancestry, but were born in the Americas. So somebody whose parents were both born in Europe, they just happened to have been born in the Americas. Creoles, in a lot of places, were at the very top of society. But whenever someone from Europe came over and established themselves in the colonies, they kind of had to take a hit down on the social ladder. Next down on the list were the mestizos, and these were people who had mixed ancestry, most commonly people who were half European and half Native American, and then you have an enormously huge generational shift after that. In French colonies, mestizos were sometimes also called Creoles, and they were also called métis. Métis is an interesting term because there's a Native American people from Canada who are called the métis, but then they are also just half European, half Native American people from what is the modern day United States. Native Americans came below the mestizos. Below them, you had mulattos. Mulattos were people who were half European, half African. And then at the very bottom of the ladder, as we might expect, were slaves, who tended to be of African descent. The images that you guys see here are images of the different social, which were also ethnic or racial categories, which is particularly true of Spanish societies. In English territories and Dutch territories, you didn't have a whole lot of mingling between Europeans and non-Europeans. Certainly not for the purposes of, say, starting a family or something like that. But it was surprisingly common in Spanish areas, in Portuguese areas, and even in French areas. And so you did have this attempt to try to categorize people across the different genetic possibilities. The image that you guys see here up on the left is of a family that has produced a mestizo. So the little boy that you see here is a mestizo. He is the product of one Native American parent, his mother, and one Spanish parent, his father. The image that you see down at the bottom right shows a mulatto family, and it shows a really interesting aspect of genetics here as well. You have a child who is a mulatto, another child who's a mulatto, different skin tones, a father who is European, and a mother who is African. This tended to be the way in which mixed families were created. Usually, the women were the mistresses of the European men, and they also had fully European wives. But their children were the inheritors of all of these different racial categories. What I like about this image here on the right is that it shows one of the aspects, a really important aspect of colonial society, which is the concept of, quote, passing, end quote, right? That a child of mixed parentage, of mixed ethnicities, because of their skin tone, might be able to pass for somewhere above their own traditional social category. So the child on the left, whose skin tone is dark like his mother's, would have been known as a mulatto. There's no way to get around that, right? If they knew who his father was, they would have known that he was in fact a mulatto. However, the child on the right has a much lighter skin tone. That child might be able to pass for a mestizo, maybe a Creole, and depending on eye color, hair color, etc., may even have been able to pass for European born, which would allow that child to have much more opportunity in colonial society than his brother would have had. And so what we see is over countless generations, the people who comprise the largest part of the population are actually those in the middle. The mestizos, Native Americans, and mulattoes, they become the larger part of the population, but they're stuck kind of in the lower middle part of the social ladder. So they don't have a whole lot of political power, they don't have a whole lot of wealth, but they have a whole lot of people. And that's ultimately what's going to start bringing about really dramatic change once we head into the 19th century in the Americas. I'd like to finish with this image, which shows just kind of in a large format the relationships, economic and social really, between Europe's Africa and the Americas. I want to start by pointing out the slave trade, which we saw on a previous slide. Obviously, it goes from Africa to the West, but most often it used a kind of middle Atlantic route, this route right here, which is why it was known as the Middle Passage. This speaks particularly to slavery or of the slave trade, so you shouldn't use that phrase for anything else about this relationship here. The trade relationship that we see forming between North America, Europe, and Africa is known as the triangular trade for obvious reasons. If you just look at the lines on the map, you can see that they form a rough triangle. And what we see happening mostly is that with the help of human labor resources as well as gold coming from Africa to the Americas, we have these used to produce raw resources, mostly cotton, tobacco, coffee, rice, furs, timber, that sort of thing. These goods are then shifted over to Europe, and in Europe, they are manufactured by Europeans. They are manufactured into cloth, into glass, into ships, into a variety of other goods. And once manufactured, they are then attempted to be sold around the world, not just in Africa, where they're exchanged for slaves, but also back across the Atlantic, where they are sold to colonial populations. So we have a really intense commercial connection, which is known as triangular trade. That said, none of this would have been possible without that initial exchange of goods that occurs as a result of Columbus accidentally landing in the quote-unquote New World in 1492. This initial exchange is known as the Columbian Exchange. You guys read about this in your textbook. That would be in chapter 17. But I want to talk about it for a little bit because it's important. The Columbian Exchange was what first brought about this recognition on the side of the Europeans that they could use and exploit resources in the Americas. And not just resources that were immediately valuable, like gold and silver, which of course they saw, especially in Aztec and Incan areas, but also the crops, the plants and animals that are native to the Americas. So for example, Europeans begin to import corn. They import the potato, the sweet potato. They import the tomato. And as you can just think about, this has an enormous impact on the diet, the cuisine of Europe over time. Of course, the Europeans also bring to the Native Americans some less beneficial things in exchange, right? Yes, you get the horse and you get cattle, that's awesome. You get wheat, definitely a game changer for Native Americans. But you also get diseases to which the Native Americans had never been exposed, right? Smallpox being perhaps the most dangerous and most fatal of those. So we do have a spread of disease that does a pretty good job of really bringing down the population of Native Americans in the immediate aftermath of Europeans' arrival. That said, Europeans also take back to Europe diseases that they had never been exposed to, various venereal diseases which suddenly run rampant across Europe and cause a pretty extreme havoc out there, diseases like syphilis. So, good and bad coming back and forth, but ultimately, what we see happening is a melding of cultures because of the introduction of European ideas, because of the exchange of Native American ideas. And so, really, when we look at the Age of Exploration, we need to understand it as the first age of globalization, which we tend to only see as a very modern and recent thing. Because what we understand, in large measure, as European culture would not be there without the introduction of these little things like the potato and the tomato from Native America. And what we think of in some ways as traditionally Native American things, like Native Americans fighting on horseback, would never have been possible without Europeans bringing the horse back to the Americas after its extinction there. So when we look at this era in time, were there bad things that were going on? Absolutely. Were there good things that were going on? Absolutely. And when we evaluate the Age of Exploration, when we look at net benefits and detriments, we have to consider everything that was going on and not just one thing, not just the thing that we tend to focus on, at least in the past when we're looking at the Age of Exploration. We need to look at the whole, the big picture, and see how those exchanges really benefited or not the world as a whole.